Hi, Susan. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining breakfast at Kuznach in this coronavirus time. I would ask a very simple question. How are you?
I am well. I am sheltering in place as most of the world is, and generally feeling anxious and stressed like everybody else.
This was actually my second question. How do you feel about the whole coronavirus thing?
Well, I've obviously been thinking about it a good deal. I teach Jungian related material to graduate students, so it's something we've been discussing. One thing I find very helpful is the very simple notion that the unconscious is that which overwhelms us. And I find that a useful starting place with people who are not educated in Jung, because it is my job to often educate them from the beginning, that makes a kind of sense as to why depth psychology, Jungian psychology is important. The unconscious is that which overwhelms us, which suggests that the coronavirus is the unconscious. And I think that's a useful, even correct way of looking at it, because we are material and spiritual beings. The coronavirus has a material and spiritual dimension. So there's that. And thinking of it like that I think, puts us in the picture. It's not that the coronavirus is something out there, it's actually part of our reality that we're dealing with. And in terms of what Jungians believe about the unconscious and the psyche, we can start to see possibilities of fertility in the immense suffering and destruction that we're facing. The other thing that I'm finding useful from a kind of imaginative point of view is alchemy. So I've been discussing it with my students in alchemical terms as a kind of alchemy of the collective, a transformation of the collective with us in a very dark nigredo state where we're forced to get to the prima materia, the core stuff of our existence and what matters to us as human beings, as individuals, but more particularly, we're being forced to get to the essence of ourselves as families, communities, nations, and collectives.
Talking about alchemy, I cannot avoid the question, who was Jung? Or who is your own Jung?
Well, I've never been able to get away from Jung as such a kind of useful perspective. And as somebody who is a Jungian but not a clinician, that's an interesting position to be in. But my research for 35 years has been into Jungian psychology, Jungian writing, and then in the context of the arts and in the context of gender. I've done a lot of, I've published a lot on Jung's writings, and here I have a very distinctive position because my Jung is not Jung the person so much as Jung the text. And I'm not interested in questions like, what did Jung really mean by this? Because although that's a very normal way to approach Jung's writings, and I'm not saying it's wrong, it's not a necessary way of approaching Jung's writings because it is buying into a very cultural notion of an author. the idea of an author of a piece of writing as the god of the text. The author owns the meanings of the text, and we can get to the ultimate meaning of the text if only we could get into the mind of the author. This is a very okay idea, but it's a very cultural idea. It was invented more or less about the time of Romanticism, and Jung himself has an interesting relationship to Romanticism. And what we see when we kind of put this idea of the author in next to Jungian psychology is that the idea of the author is the privileging of the ego. It is the notion that there is a single fixed meaning to a word, to a sentence, to a whole piece of writing. And that's okay, but it really isn't Jungian, because Jung is all about not privileging the ego. What I find fascinating is that there is quite a lot of evidence, if you read Jung carefully, that this is an attitude he understood and was writing from. So, for example, he says of his own theorizing, nobody drew the conclusion that if we take the unconscious seriously, then all our knowledge must be incomplete, and moreover to a degree that we cannot determine. Now, that's a really radical statement. This is Jung in the collected works. It comes in, his essay on his psychology, saying there is no kind of one truth here. There is no absolute truth, because we don't know all the stuff we don't know. He's fascinating to me because he writes from a kind of honoring of mystery and unknowing, and the possibilities that meanings will continue to be generated over time around his own work. His book Aeon, for example, is a demonstration of symbolic systems ending with his own theory as a symbolic system that will change, that will be superseded. To me, Jung is a modernist. He's an arts-based researcher. He's a performative writer. He's a trickster writer, and he's a comic writer. Comedy is really important to Jung's writings. Freud is in essence tragic. Jung is in essence comic, both in the sense of there are jokes and they matter, but also in the sense of divine comedy and the way comedy is about death and rebirth. Death and rebirth of meaning is included there.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about death and rebirth at time of coronavirus, but I want to stick on your attitude toward translation. There are people like Dr. Gigerich who says an author has to be read in his original language, otherwise you cannot really grasp its essence. What is your take on this?
Okay, first of all, I respect that. I have been critical in my publications of Gigerich. I have been critical of Sonu Shamdasani, but my criticism says what these scholars are doing is perfectly legitimate. My criticism is in the attitude that what they're saying is the only perspective. I think multiplicity is at the essence of Jung, and multiplicity is at the essence of the kinds of scholarly work that I do. And if we take what you've just said about Gigerich, if you want to get to the essence of an author, yes, fine. If you want to treat Jung as an author, as someone who controls the meanings of the words he uses, then fine. Clearly, it's important that most of these words were first written in German, and I respect that. But first of all, I think treating Jung as an author is not Jungian, because Jung was all about dethroning the ego and dethroning fixed meanings. So it's a cultural fantasy to treat Jung as an author, a cultural fantasy that is very much tied to certain trends in Western modernity of the last few hundred years. Also, let us accept that translation is a fantasy also. Languages are not mirror images of each other. They do not translate, not in the way we imagine translation. Now, of course, translation occurs. I've read translations. My work is looking at Jung in English translation. And so you could say that that's, I can understand people who say that is not really getting to Jung because most of these texts were originally written in German. But it's still, that is all part of this fantasy ethos that is ego privileging. Western modernity privileges the ego in a number of different levels. One of them is the fantasy that things can be translated, and another of them is the fantasy that the author authorizes. Think of, there is and in English we talk about the authorized version of the Bible. Christian communities have continually tried to produce their version of the Bible, and they argue and fight one another, and historically have killed one another because of their translation of the Bible. If you stop having a fantasy of fixed meanings, then it is possible to reimagine a relationship between different perspectives on a text that is not one of conquest and annihilation. So with translation, on the one hand, I get that people are making a very conventional, I would say, but reasonable and widely held objection to somebody working with an English translation of Jung and claiming to be a Jungian. But I still say that my work is profoundly Jungian because it dethrones the ego and looks for the way in which the texts themselves are fluid and playful and multiple, that they have many voices in them. The unevenness of Jung's writing is because he allows different archetypes to come into the writing. Now, this may sound weird, but it isn't weird because it's saying Jung is a kind of novelist more than he is a traditional scientist. We have a lot of conventional expectations about what science is like, and the division between science and the arts, again, one of the great schisms of modernity, has meant that this privileging of the ego has become a sort of dogma that has kind of poisoned a lot of our knowledge as well as our social being.
You have your own approach to Jung. I would dare to say a reformed approach to Jung. Joke, obviously. What is Jung's relevance today?
Well, I think Jung's relevance today is enormous because I think this notion that the unconscious is that which overwhelms us is, again, a very centrally Jungian perspective. And it is a kind of practical way of dealing with those overwhelming things that we are facing as a species, not even as a culture, but as a species. So the coronavirus, the other overwhelming thing is, of course, the climate emergency. Both of these are the unconscious in very real and immediate ways. And Jungian psychology is a way of facing that without being overwhelmed and made simply paralyzed by kind of fear and terror. That's a big point, but obviously extremely important. There are two things about Jung in academia that I think are very exciting and very new. One is that Jung anticipates transdisciplinarity, which I've been working on and writing about for the last couple of years. And transdisciplinarity is a way of bringing all the academic disciplines together in a way that has a social, ethical, and religious vision that is about the whole planet working ethically together, but respecting each other's differences. Jung really does anticipate that if you kind of dig into some of his attitudes to knowledge, for example. Now, as part of that, there is a new way of doing research called arts-based research. And it's out there, it's in the social sciences mainly, and it's specific because it's not art as a result of research, it's not art about research, it's not art illustrating research, it is making art is a way of making knowledge. And it's new that the Academy is doing this. It started in the late 1990s. Arts-based researchers are really interested in the image, the psychic image, and intuition. They don't have a very good language for exploring this. Jung provides the language for exploring intuition well, in fact, Jung's 4 functions are really quite helpful here. So sensation and thinking and feeling and the whole kind of ethical way in which the psyche would work. Another way of putting this, Stefano, is that arts-based research is doing psychotherapy with the world. What you do as a clinician with a client, the way you kind of work together in a kind of temenos and create something. Well, that's what the arts-based researcher does. Jungian arts-based research materializes the psychic image. And I must stress, when I say arts-based research, I'm using arts plural. It's not limited to painting. My own arts-based research practice is fiction writing. But any artistic mode is enhanced by being research because it takes art out of its box that it's been put into by modernity. And art as research is enhanced by a Jungian perspective because that way we can kind of negotiate the role of the psyche and the role of the psyche going out into the world, because arts-based research has something for Jungians in that it has art, which is a system of, art has a heritage, it has a cultural location, it has ideas and philosophies already with it. So by doing arts-based research, Jungians can get their Jungian work into the world in a way that communicates it, that is so much more difficult to do when you're writing as a clinician and trying to explain why what you do with patients is so important.
Can you say a little bit more how you engage with patients with your arts-based research? How do you work with them? Because I can imagine active imagination, as we are taught during training, dreams analysis, sound play, even poetry. What is your take? How do you do it? If you can share something more.
Well, it comes down to the image. And, you know, Jung says the image is the kind of emanation from the unconscious. It's our sense of something from the unconscious. And yeah, that can go into active imagination, or it is materialized in art. So the image generates the writing of a poem, or the image generates a painting. The image generates film. I actually have a dissertation student, PhD student, who talked to film directors about the psychic image. That was and it was a very real conversation to them, that what it was inside of them that, you know, led them to produce certain types of work. So it is, you know, whereas you might talk about dreams with patient, the Artspace researcher is taking that psychic material and making it visible and communicable through the medium of art.
One of my supervisors years ago suggested with a patient, to a patient who claimed she was writing a letter to her father since many years. She was not able to finish this sentence. This supervisor suggests, well, tell her to keep writing without having in mind to hand in the letter. It didn't work. This patient is still dealing with the task of writing. What would you suggest her?
Yeah, I think I should say that arts-based research is not exactly the same as art psychotherapy. You know, they are distinct, because obviously art therapy privileges the therapy. That is the important thing. Whereas arts-based research is about making art, and it won't necessarily make the artist feel better to do it. There is a different pull towards the art, and art is something that goes out into the world. It is not tied to the person of the artist. Okay, it's very interesting you use that example. I had a student I was teaching who had unfinished business with her mother. Who doesn't have unfinished business with their mothers? And she was a playwright, and she wanted to write a play about this, and she did, but it wasn't working. She too got stuck, and we looked at alchemy, and then, having been absorbed in this notion of arts-based research and Jungian psychology, she sat down and said, okay, her mother was dead. Okay, Mum, you know, come and help me with this. And they did a dialogue. This, you know, the parent came alive. You know, whether you know, some people would say her spirit came back from the dead. Some people would say her archetype was activated. However you want to put it, what I love about Jung is that you don't have to buy into one particular reality. You know, that dialogue happened and has gone on and produced the play, which I saw performed, and it was fabulous and incredibly funny. I would say to that patient, on the one hand, why don't you change the medium? Why don't you paint a picture? Or why don't you dance? That would be me imagining myself in a therapeutic role. If that person was interested in writing as their art form, their creative practice, I would say it's time to talk to him. It's time to summon him and bring him back.
This leads me to the concept of certainties. At the beginning of this conversation, you said that coronavirus is the unconscious or could be linked to the unconscious. These days, especially in Italy, where I come from, in Spain, where my wife is from, New York, any other countries, we see a suspension of time. Time is now suspended. And we could say, perhaps, or could we say that nighttime, sleeping, dreaming, dreams are actually a suspension of certainties, a suspension of the ego. And you said coronavirus could be linked to the ego. Certainties or certainties could be linked to the ego and coronavirus. Why do we need uncertainties? Why do we need to sleep at night?
Well,
why is the word suspended right now?
Yeah. Because certainties we cannot live in certainties. Certainties are not what human beings are. The certainties or the assumptions that we've taken to be certain about our lives and our society, we've lived them mostly unconsciously. They've mostly just been there, and you go about your business and you don't think about how all the assumptions that are structuring that. And it seems to be human nature that we need to grow, to develop. I think this ultimately comes to, why do we have to die? Because that is putting a limit to our time. And by putting a limit to our time, it allows us to make certain kinds of meanings that we wouldn't have if we just felt we were going to go on forever. So I would say, and I feel this is a very kind of Jungian position, that humans are not healthy or alive if they have too much certainty. Also, humans are rather dangerous if they have too much certainty. They don't agree, and if they're certain about the things that other people don't agree on, the community kind of breaks down. In the United States, where I've lived for 10 years, but you can tell from my accent I'm not indigenously American. In the United States, there's been a kind of paralysis in the politics because there has been two sides, both full of certainties, and an inability to change, adapt, appreciate the other position. And all of that is being wiped away by the virus. That the virus is a kind of invasion of the disruptive, unknown psyche into our collective world and challenging all sorts of basic assumptions, including the assumptions that we are individuals. We're all being asked to stay at home in order to save lives that we can't see and can't know and be certain about. And yet also that life might be our own. So we're being asked to act as part of a collective in a very urgent way. And that's wiping away a certainty that I think perhaps particularly in the United States, but also in the European world, we've had this sense of ourselves as individuals, as a single being, as autonomous. We can make choices. We can do all these things with our lives. We can't do most of those things now. And it's essential So I think it's about being alive. I think it's about being happy. I think it's about human nature that we need. I think Jung was absolutely right. We are beings that seek meaning, and you can't. If you are too full of certainties, then you are dead, because the meanings that you have them unconsciously. They aren't real, and you are kind of empty because you're not interacting with meaning and you're not creating meaning. Put another way, creativity is at the heart of who we are. We have to be creating in a very broad sense in order to go on living.
Yeah, and too much certainties perhaps bring to stagnation, which is the opposite than creativity. I want to share a dream a patient brought today in a session. The dream is the following. I am dancing with Stephen Hawking. Second part of the dream, I am trying to figure out how to teach yoga to Stephen Hawking, who is someone unable to feel the body and to breathe. I was very much touched by this dream, not only because Stephen Hawking was a BA student in the same college where I studied at Cambridge. And at that time, in his age, he was in his early 20s and I was in my 20s as well. And we both had an healthy body. Stephen Hawking went on with his master and PhD and he lost his healthy body. And he became trapped in a body that didn't support his genius mind. Then my mind during the session went thinking of us now locked in a body, in a house, in a box. And the impossibility of creativity. So many people get addicted to Netflix, to WhatsApp, to Tinder, beyond the usual addictions. And I find it poetical that this patient dreamt, how can I dance with him? How can I teach him yoga, although he has respiratory problem, coronavirus, and he doesn't feel? We really have problems with feeling nowadays. What comes to your mind?
The Enchantments of Technology. It's a book by a Jung, from a Jungian point of view about technology, arguing really just what you've said, that there's been this radical split. Ultimately, this notion of us being subjects and everything out there being objects, which happened to Stephen Hawking in the sense that he had this fabulous mind, and his body was an object really that he couldn't connect with. And as you've said, we are in our houses, and we think of out there as an object that we're not connected with, and that could include the house itself. And you're right, addiction is a way of avoiding that problem. But it's only a way of imagining ourselves in the world, this split. I mean, Stephen Hawking, an incredible example, an incredible hero. He still needed his body. The body was it was still that which was keeping him alive. There was still that connection between the mind and the body. However difficult it might be for us to imagine it. And technology, which we've split off from, and the obvious example here is the American obsession with guns, and this notion that guns don't kill people, people do. So it's all right to have a gun. Well, if I pick up a gun, I change, you know. And so we have this unconsciousness of how we are psychically invested in technology. And this book by Lee Bailey is very good on this. It was published in 2005, before social media, before we found out after 2016 that basically social media had invaded people's psyches, and elections had been manipulated through this. So we are part of this technology, but we have this terrible unconsciousness of it. We're not conscious of the way social media manipulated us then and is manipulating us now. So I think that one of the things you may be pointing to is we are called upon to try to get out of our unconsciousness around technology.
I've been trying to underline the point that until 2 weeks ago, we live in the external world, in the extroverted world, and now we are forced to live the certainties of this extroverted world, the entertainment society, the polemic society of the all-you-can-eat. And as Stephen Hawking had to do, going inward and find resources he would not have dared to find or to look for before his body dumped him.
Yes, I totally agree with that, but I don't think that's the whole story, because he went inward and he went outward. If he had cared about the world, he would not have done his work, and he certainly would not have communicated it to the world. So it's not just about going inward, it is about going outward. And we need to find ways of loving one another through technology. We need to find ways of loving one another at this time of isolation. And in a way, you could say all the anxiety, that there is a kind of very pragmatic, concrete thing here, and that is, the world, every country in the world is trying to get ventilators, and companies who make cars are making ventilators, and etc. So there's all that kind of anxiety and that understanding that this will save lives, but also people are finding ways to help one another via this technology that we're using now. So there are signs of fertility in the darkness, but it is a very dark time. And what I think is a very important myth of our situation with technology is Frankenstein. That Frankenstein is our mistakes with technology, because Frankenstein was created out of fear and could not be loved. It was a technology that could not be loved. And similarly, we created nuclear weapons out of great fear, and an inability to love. So I think what people are starting to discover is they can find ways of expressing and living their love for each other. And I mean this in all kinds of ways, including helping people in their communities, that there is a chance that the addictive and deadening technology that you've pointed to in the binging on Netflix, that there is a chance that people are starting to individuate their technology. I'm not saying, everything's going to be, our problems with technology will be over in 6 months' time. But I think our relationship to it is being forced to change, because this is the only way we can be with our friends and other members of our family and also take part, do our work, be with our colleagues, be with our students, that Stephen Hawking went in because he loved the world, because he wanted to contribute. And he was spiritually excited by what he could contribute. And that spirit enabled him to survive far, far longer than most people with his illness. He was a kind of medical marvel. And it must have been because his spirit infused his body and vice versa.
Thank you, Susan. What a great pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you. It's been lovely, and I really appreciate what you're doing, and I'm very honored to be part of this series.
Thank you.